Welcome to our New York City Design Leader Conversations. This conversation today is one of a series of 6 taking place during Design Days, which is a 6-day-long celebration of New York City's creative design industry. Today, we're focused on outdoor design and the power of this design medium to build communities, bring about renewal, and inspire positive change. My name is Elissa Black, and I'm the Executive Director of NYC by Design, tuning in today from Brooklyn, New York. New York City by Design is a newly minted nonprofit organization, but we have been around since 2013, nurturing and creating opportunities for all of New York City's design professions, peoples, industries, and events. We represent the design community of New York City in its broadest sense, meaning all of its design professions, from architects to interior designers, textile, fashion, digital and tech and graphic designers, and designers of every discipline. We also represent design adjacent enterprises in the city, including your makers, manufacturers, suppliers, design districts, and events, along with our design-leading cultural and academic institutions. New York City by Design has year-round programming that seeks to achieve 3 things. We celebrate and educate about design and spotlight New York City's design talent. We bring new and equitable opportunities to New York City's design sector, and we encourage our city's young adults to become our designers of tomorrow. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome one of New York City's leading landscape architects and urban designers who has been bringing her outdoor artistry to bear in support of our communities and inspiring us all about the possibilities of outdoor design right across this city and beyond. So welcome to Sidney Nielsen, landscape architect and founding principal at Matthews Nielsen Landscape Architects, MNLA. Sidney is a professor of urban design and landscape architecture at Pratt Institute in both the graduate and undergraduate schools of architecture. She serves as president of the Public Design Commission of New York City and is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Welcome, Sidney. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you.
I'd like to start with asking you about what informs your projects the most and how you started off in the work of outdoor design. So if you'll take us through, what is it that led you to landscape architecture and the work of outdoor design? And how did you end up in this work?
Well, it is a rocky road that got me here. I guess I would start out by saying that I was raised by a mother and father who really believed in a commitment to public service. So that was kind of a lens that led me all the way through. I had thought about a career in environmental law, but realized that sort of my creative quarter, whatever, would not be, there was really no outlet for it in that type of career. So I just abandoned that idea. But being jobless, I took a job as a construction worker with a bunch of architects from the Yale School of Architecture who had been given some money to build a school they had designed as their thesis project. And the site was incredible. It was in the mountains of Colorado. And to make a long story short, after doing this for about 9 months, I realized that I really enjoyed this relationship of building and thinking and designing. And then, of course, I was in this incredible environment of the mountains of Colorado. So what I decided is that those mountains didn't need me, but New York City, which is effectively my home, did need me. So I came back to New York, thought about, somebody introduced me to the term landscape architecture, which I'd never heard in my entire life. And I said, that's for me.
That's a great career path there. And you've led, I think it's more than 400 projects, both nationally and globally. And I'm curious if there's something amongst those projects that really unites them in terms of the way that you approach them and the way that you're working in this field of outdoor design.
Well, I think it's probably a for me, a twofold challenge of trying to make meaningful spaces for people, while at the same time trying to improve environmental integrity. And so, of course, in an urban area, that can be sometimes restoration of ecological systems, and at other times it's nurturing of systems to function more sustainably. But I guess it's always been that kind of two-pronged initiative of both people and the environment, recognizing that, you know, in New York, ever since I lived here, it has been, shall we say, a somewhat degraded environment. Getting better though.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on that, are there any of like your New York projects that come out as favorites other than your coming project, Little Island, which we'll talk about later? What's really stood out to you, or what's been important to you in the New York landscape?
Well, I think if my favorite projects fall into kind of two buckets, those that transform post-industrial, neglected, abandoned places into new destinations. Thinking about Fulton Landing Pier back in the 90s, before Brooklyn Bridge Park even existed. Built projects, Hudson River Park, which, you know, people don't remember that back in the early 90s, that was, you know, just abandoned piers and parking lots. And so that's one bucket. The second bucket are those projects that I would say bring new value to existing open spaces. So I'm thinking about Lincoln Center, when they tried to kind of reimagine the next generation of people who would enjoy Lincoln Center, higher education campuses, of course. And then something that we've started doing a number of, which is really transforming post-war multifamily housing, such as Stuyvesant Town or Lefrak City, and really giving them new life and significant upgrades that are really meaningful to the people who live there. So those are the kind of two buckets.
Yeah, they sound fantastic. I know that you've mentioned that being in the position of a landscape designer and architect, that you really have to inhabit this position of a Renaissance person, which meaning knowing a whole lot about a whole lot of things. So you had mentioned natural science to physics to human nature. And I just wanted to sort of hear a little bit from you about how that comes to fruition in your projects. And, you know, what was the moment in time where you realized that was the approach to outdoor design that was necessary for successful work?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if I can put a time on it, but certainly when I was in landscape architecture school, it was a much simpler time, I would say. And we were, I think, educated to believe that we could do it all. We could have mastery over all of the different aspects that it would take to realize and design a project. Somewhere along the line, it became abundantly clear that if you were going to really try to restore natural systems, that there was no way that at least I personally had the deep knowledge of whatever system, hydrologic, marine, etc., that would enable me to do this without help. And so I'd say maybe in the past 2 decades at least, I've come to realize that Renaissance statement that I've made, that we are more like conductors of an orchestra. Mm-hmm. You know, I personally could never be the first violinist or the cellist, but I need all those people in order to make ultimately the music that we are trying to make as designers. And whether you're, I think, an architect or a landscape architect, and there may be other disciplines I'm leaving out, that we need the skills of these, you know, these brilliant musicians in order to make our music. So it does require that we understand what those disciplines and specialties bring to us, so we can ask the right questions and bring those people on at appropriate times. But I don't, I mean, at this point, I have completely given up mastering all that it would take to do the different kinds of projects we're confronted with.
Yeah, I think that that point of like constellations of individuals is a really great one. And in recent times, what's been brought to my mind is the ability of the design professions across the different disciplines to really come together in design-based collaborations to act on, the major societal issues that we've been facing in recent months and years. So I think about the design industry and all of its different aspects coming together to act on the issues that we faced around COVID, and being able to have pandemic response, both in terms of PPE and digital apps that are helping us with COVID tracking and vaccine delivery, along with the immense effort of our interior landscape and architecture designers who are really creating the physical, social, and workspaces that were quite transformational compared to how we've been operating before. And, something close to my heart is really thinking about the potential of those design collaborations, because I've seen them come together to act on issues such as justice, climate mitigation, community resilience and recovery, issues of racial inequity and community recovery, along with inclusivity and access. So I know that at MNLA, you've talked about landscape architecture as more than a profession, like its capacity to heal and reinvigorate, and the responsibility that comes with creating those kinds of environments. And I'm curious to hear from you, like in this moment of COVID and reflecting on the past 14 months of social unrest and a real time that none of us had ever experienced before. Like, what have your thoughts been about, like, the role of outdoor design, what the role of outdoor design played during these past 14 months and what it can do going forward?
You said we've never experienced this before, but I have to say that I am old enough that I was very conscious during the 60s and 70s. And I recall myself, participating in any number of protests, marches, sit-ins, what have you, each of which took place in public space. So whether, we were protesting at Boston City Hall or on the US Mall in Washington, campus spaces, or even just streets. And so sadly, history has an unfortunate habit of repeating itself. And many of the same triggers of social unrest are manifesting themselves again today. So it comes as no surprise to me that this is occurring again in the public realm. Streets, politically iconic public spaces, locally significant spaces that become venues for protests. So I think it's, so when I think about public space design, to me, it's imperative that these spaces continue to be open and what I call porous and flexible to accept these expressions for social change. And, I think a lot about Boston City Hall, which in many people's minds is considered to be a really terribly designed space. It's big, it's vapid, it's windy. There's kind of no there, hodgepodge of different stylistic architectural periods all mushed together. But I have to say that it was designed intentionally to be a democratic space with a little d. And it has its place in that regard. And also the National Mall, which again is sort of almost inhumanely huge, but it is our national common ground. And so I think there are places for these kinds of spaces. More often than not, streets function that way. They just override the cars, people take over the streets, and it's great. So I think that's why I'm talking about this porosity, that spaces need to be able to swell and shrink, so that in non-tumultuous times the space feels comfortable, but in more expressive times they can expand, like like an elastic, if you will. So that's how I think about the social unrest, that we have to accept it, we have to allow for it, and as designers we have an obligation to do our part in ensuring that there is this balance of space throughout a city, a town, for these to occur. Now, as for the impacts of the pandemic, I'm thrilled that with all of the apps and technology that are available to us today, we have excellent documentation of the value of open space, and in terms of its the solace it gave people, the wellness that it was able to contribute, as well as the kind of social interaction that could take place outside of a closed environment. But we also have very well documented the negative health outcomes from communities that lack access to outdoor space. And it is, there are some really demonstrable relationships between the spread of the pandemic and those communities that have poor health outcomes and lack of open space. So to me, the way forward there is for each of us, in whatever way we can, to advocate for greater investment in both new and quality public spaces in these underinvested communities, or even disinvested communities.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Very necessary work, and definitely a place for all of us to be creating those circumstances of equity in outdoor space as we go forward in the city. I wanted to shift us for a moment over to a fantastic project that is soon to open, which is Little Island in New York City. So you've been a leading designer in collaboration with NYCxStudio, designing what was formerly Pier 55 and now becoming, or almost become, a 2.4 acre public park on the Hudson River. And as we're seeing it emerge, it's certainly captivating and innovative, both in its architecture and its landscape, and definitely inspiring about the possibilities of design and outdoor design. So I wanted to dive into that project a little bit with you. Curious about how you first became involved and how long you've been involved in that project.
Yes, it's been a while. And actually we were having a team Zoom drink, recalling how many children and grandchildren and marriages have taken place over the course of this among the team. And it's really quite remarkable. So
it sounds like the stuff of documentary. That might be the next project.
I'm hoping. So we began in the middle of 2013. So by that point, Mr. Diller had conducted a small competition. NYCxStudio had been selected. Their first design was absolutely beautiful, but deemed to be too costly. And so they were coming back with a second design. And that's the time when they realized that they needed to build out the rest of the team. And so we were interviewed for the project, and I'll never forget, first the NYCxStudio interviewed me, and then I was interviewed by Mr. Diller, as well as Hudson River Park Trust. And we're sitting around a very large conference table. I'd only met most of these folks for about 10 minutes. And Mr. Diller looked at me and he said, "Can I trust you to keep these guys in line?" I looked across the table and I thought, is there any right way to answer that question?
That's a tough one.
So I said, yes, I could do that. And so a couple of weeks later, I was notified that we had been selected. So anyway, middle of 2013, here we are, middle of 2021. So that is how many years that is, 8 years. I've been working on this.
Wow. And in terms of like, would you give us like a general description of what your work was on Little Island and how we're going to see that when we're actually able to visit?
I mean, one could simply describe it, but it would be an erroneous description of the fact that we are kind of the icing on the cake of this structure. But the truth is that the structure itself plays such a huge role in what the landscape is and can be and how it was designed, that really you can't separate those two things. Although, you know, from a distance, it does appear that way. In other words, when you're looking at the project from the Esplanade right now, you see the structure and then you see sort of the green on top, and it looks like icing on a cake, but they are really deeply integrated. So our role, we are considered the architects of record in addition to being the landscape architect. So under our firm was also the marine engineers and the structural engineers, and also the mechanical and electrical engineers. But then when it comes to, say, the finishes that you'll find on the pier, the paving materials, the seating, the stairs that you walk on, the handrails that you touch, this was all done very collaboratively with Heatherwick Studio. We began down a path which has been really very gratifying, that an enormous number of materials and contractors are from New York State. And so that in and of itself is really quite a lovely story, but it's that kind of familiarity with materials that Heatherwick needed our advice on. And we would usually, they would have an idea, we would develop the idea, we'd go back and forth, we would recommend some colors or materials or what have you, they'd review them, they would, you know, and then we'd come to a decision. And of course, there were any number of design review moments along the way with the client team.
Sounds like quite the orchestra that you were referencing earlier.
It was a great
and lots
orchestra.
of learning maybe about marine science and, you know, the structure, because it's certainly very definitive.
I learned a lot about structural engineering, I will say.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you found the most challenging aspect of that project, and then on the other hand, the most rewarding aspect.
Well, I think I'm going to go back to the structure part. So it was always envisioned, both by Heatherwick and at Mr. Diller's request, that the pier landscape look mature on the day it opens. So you take a mature tree that is 30 to 40 feet tall, of which we have a number. And then you envision the size of the root ball, the soil that comes with that tree. And you're quickly looking at 15 to 20,000 pounds of weight and a requirement for a great deal of soil in order for this tree to thrive. And so we had a design. We defined the soil depths that were needed for this design. We gave it to the structural engineers, and I'll never forget, we worked only in 3 dimensions, in essentially Rhino.
Mhm.
And so we got a drawing back, and they gave us the weight loads that the piles could take and the pots. And I think something like 3/4 of the trees didn't fit. So we then started modeling root balls and moving them around in the soil volumes to try to push and pull. And sometimes this would require, because the piles had a capacity. There was nothing we could do to increase the capacity of the piles. But there were places where we could alter the way in which the pots joined together to create a greater depth. And so that meant that Heatherwick had to restudy sort of the elevation.
Mhm.
And then we needed to restudy where the trees could go. So it literally took 1 year to come up with a final, what I would call soil depth plan that allowed us then to move forward with the tree planting, because the other plant material, well, there was no challenge associated with those depths. So that I would say was the biggest challenge, and the most rewarding. I'm hoping that there are going to be 2 most rewarding things, but I can only speak to one right now,
Okay.
which is the collaboration with this remarkable client team, as well as design and technical team, really extraordinary. And, you know, in all of these 8 years, aside from the kids and the grandkids and whatnot, we have really grown incredibly close. We trust each other. We trust each other's judgments. We really are a very united team, and that is has been incredibly rewarding. You know, so often toward the end of a project, finger pointing sort of starts to, you know, occur and whatnot. That has absolutely not occurred at all, and quite the contrary, I would say, really. So the second most rewarding remains to be seen, which is, will the landscape live up to the vision that I have intended? And right now, we planted everything. I would say we concluded the planting really in the winter of 2020. So I was planting what appeared to be dead plants. And now we're in spring. And so, you know, it's beginning to come alive. And every time that I'm there, which is at least twice a week, you know, I walk around and I go, oh, look. Anyway, it's kind of silly.
That's fantastic. Feeling of renewal for the city. What is the anticipated opening date?
We are looking at somewhere in the end of May, early June, is what I'm not allowed to say, but I believe is the time frame.
We're looking very forward to it. So I just have time for one final question for you. And at NYC by Design, we're very focused on making sure that the design professions of New York City are equitable, diverse, inclusive, vibrant, and thriving. And at MNLA, you're a certified women-owned business enterprise, and you've courageously made incredible strides in the outdoor design world as a woman and a sector leader. So I'm curious, either for yourself or for the emerging professionals in the industry, you know, either what advice would you have given your younger self as you entered this design industry, or what advice would you give to others?
Well, I guess first off, to say that when I first started in the 70s, women were a rarity in all aspects of our discipline. But there have been great strides made. I would say, however, that is not equally true for people of color. And so I think we need to separate what women have been able to accomplish and how we have been increasingly accepted versus people of color. And the people of color issue, the statistics remain as grim as, I mean, that line has really not moved in 40 years that I'm aware of. So I know that I serve on the board of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, our professional organization of the ASLA, and a number of other organizations are making concerted efforts to reach young students in even before high school, to try to encourage them to move into the design affiliated professions. I'm not just speaking about landscape architecture. But then what we need to do more than that. We've got to provide scholarships, support, mentorship, internships, so that there's kind of a whole cycle of life, really, that gets anybody to where they are. And we can't drop the ball if we're really going to move this needle forward.
Yeah, it's an imperative for all of us to act on all of those points in the system. Well, that concludes our conversation today. It's been fantastic talking to you and learning more about your projects. To the audience, please enjoy New York City's Design Days Festival, which is taking place right now. And you can check out the schedule on NYCxDESIGN.org. And thank you to SANDOW Design Group for airing today's conversation on DesignTV by SANDOW.